I'm here to talk from Content Insights. You'll find us over in the corner over here. And we do editorial analytics made by editors for editors. My background, very briefly, is that I was editorial director with Time Out International Magazine, having set up various digital and print products around the world for them before starting one of London's first content marketing departments with Arena Media, which was bought by Havas Media afterwards. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about editorial analytics and more specifically, the point that I think is we ought to take editorial analytics more seriously than we do currently. So to start with, I thought we'd have a look at this phrase, big data. It's probably one of the biggest buzz phrases of the last half decade. And I thought I'd do a little experiment with this. I started off by taking that phrase and very simply Googling it. So very quickly I found that at the moment, well, when I wrote this a month ago, 65.5 million Google search results approximately for big data at the moment, 785,000 video search results for big data, and about 250 big data tweets per day. So data and analytics clearly are everything and everywhere to many people in our industry. It's the kind of phrase that I think has broken free of its moorings, and it's commonly used by the everyman nowadays. Similarly, I did the same experiment with the phrase editorial analytics, because that's very specifically what I think that we in our industry should be thinking about. Interesting results on this one. 4,020 Google search results, 8 video search results, and 2 hashtag editorial analytics tweets per day, mostly from me, I would think, actually. The point here is really that even within our industry, people are still unaware, I think, that there's a difference between analytics in general and editorial analytics. To most people, analytics is analytics is analytics, but I think it's this distinction that's really dragging us back at the moment. For an industry like ours that likes to be first to the breaking news, we're surprisingly uncutting edge, I think. So editorial analytics, that's a new thing, right? Well, it sounds shiny and new, but it's been around for a lot longer than you might think. The problem is that, like most industries, we're kind of attracted to shiny, bleepy things that spit out vast numbers. We're so busy admiring page views and slapping each other on the backs over our scroll depths that we haven't noticed that there's a kind of emperor's new clothes dynamic that has started here. I think a lot of people don't like to admit, certainly in the editorial departments, that they don't really know what they're doing with analytics at all. They don't really know what questions they should be asking of analytics, and it's slightly embarrassing to have to ask those questions. The pertinent questions that I think that we ought to be talking about, and maybe people are starting to talk about a little bit, what the statistics really mean when they get them, how you can actually make use of them to improve your publication, and most importantly, whether you're even using the right metrics in the first place. So I thought we'd go back a little bit to early era analytics, and we'd look a little bit of the history of analytics to find out where we've kind of diverged, where we've gone slightly wrong in our industry. And I did this by looking at a guy called Thomas Davenport, who is the head of the International Institute for Analytics. And he points out that, or he believes that there are 3 eras of analytics that we've gone through. We're in the 3rd era at the moment. He goes right back to the 1950s, where he thinks the first analytics department was set up in UPS. So that was around 1950. I happen to think that we've been using editorial analytics slightly longer than that, with sort of focus groups and things like that, since about the 1920s. There's evidence as well that people were using it in wartime propaganda to perfect their messaging. But let's take it that he's correct in saying 1950s the start. So he takes little snapshots of the attitudes that were taking place in the 1950s towards analytics. And the thing that worries me slightly here is that they're very reminiscent of some of the attitudes that we have to editorial analytics, or to analytics in the editorial industry at the moment. He talks about how analysts were kept in back rooms and segregated from business people and decisions. He talks about how few organizations competed on analytics, how analytics were marginal to strategy. He talks about how decisions were made based on experience and intuition. And as I said, it's worryingly reminiscent, and happily it gets worse. So he talks about how you should take your time, Nobody is that interested in your results anyway. And he talks about how people thought, if possible, spend more time getting data ready for analysis than actually analysing it. Now, all of these attitudes are slightly laughable, or they would be if they weren't so familiar to many of the newsrooms that we see at the moment. These are quite literally 1950s attitudes. And in the editorial industry, I think having analytics still feels something a little bit like we ought to have. And I'm talking very specifically about analytics that measure engagement here. It feels a little like something that we ought to have because others have it in our industry. It's a sort of keeping up with the Joneses mentality. So from big data, moving on to the second era, Davenport talks about this starting in around the 1990s, when the internet becomes a little more ubiquitous. And the first well-known analytics package, or stats package, followed that shortly. I don't know if anybody remembers this. Anybody seen that before? So that was Urchin. Urchin's code was written in about 1997, and it was the first analytics package that was on the market for people to pick up. Urchin became, anybody guess? No, not at all. Well, it became Google Analytics in 2005. And as of 2015, Google Analytics was being used by just over half of the world's websites. And within the analytics market itself, that's about 83.4% share of the analytics market. I actually read yesterday, no time to put it into this, but I read yesterday a report that says within our industry itself, 81% of us have access to analytics of some form now, and the majority is likely to be Google Analytics. So Google Analytics is, it's great, it's very good if you're a marketer, and that's really worth underlining. Google Analytics was developed by marketers for marketers. I think its successful use of Google Analytics requires that you're predicting movement of possibly a sale from the beginning through a funnel and then being able to report it at the end. And that's something that you can do very well with Google Analytics. The trouble is that with that, it brings a sort of plethora of shiny bells and whistles that are particularly damaging, I think, to the modern editor. We've been led down a garden path of single metrics, page views, dwell time, things that we've kind of lapped up without really understanding what we're looking at. I'll come back to this shortly, but it's been incredibly damaging, I think, to our industry, and specifically how we fund our industry. So as we move into the 2000s, middle of the 2000s, we've got the explosion of social media. And what we're seeing here is platforms built on real-time instant data, bypassing human reporting, machines that can actually act on the data that they're harvesting in the moment that they harvest them. And we're also getting a strange situation where data has slightly become sexy, where data has become something that the general public are aware of. It's something that can actually record our popularity. I'm talking about things like the rise of Clout. I don't know if anybody remembers Clout, an app that used to measure your various online presences and say how important you were. And there was a point sort of I think about 5 years ago, where places like San Francisco Airport were allowing you to have VIP access if you had a Clout score of over 69 or something like that. A rather ridiculous world. I think this was data, basically, we're into data here that affected how you feel. It affected literally your dopamine levels. I mean, I think when I was a kid in maths classes, if the teacher had told me that data and analytics could affect my dopamine levels, I might have listened a little bit more closely. Moving on, in the year of big data itself was coined in 2010. And this is really where in our industry I think we start to go wrong a bit. Meanwhile, big data in the world, in the sort of data-reliant industries, is really a land grab. These data-reliant industries are racing ahead. They're really defining sales strategies using data, and they're responding instantly to consumer behavior. Algorithm enters the popular vernacular around this time. Again, I can't imagine my maths teacher would have ever foreseen a time when that was a thing. And perhaps the biggest shock, the data geeks are allowed out of their hutches. They're called data scientists, and they're given pay rises. Again, not something I think anybody could have predicted whatsoever. And in the newsroom, well, not so much. In the newsroom, this is where we diverge. In the newsroom, we're still hung up on single metrics, by which I mean page views, time spent on page, and scroll depth. We're also hung up on likes and shares. That starts happening. Everybody thinks it's a good thing. Nobody can actually really tell you what it means or how it affects you, but the more you get, the better, right? That's what it seems to be. Similarly, Twitter starts talking about page impressions, and it starts touting page impressions as the big measurement, without really telling you that a page impression can be when you scroll through something really fast and don't stop to actually read it. But because you're seeing millions and millions of page impressions on your Twitter report, it's got to be a good thing, right? We're really attracted by those big numbers. And then finally, in 2016, I think it was Mashable, but there was an article that came out about only a year ago which saw through those Emperor's New Clothes thing. It saw that the Emperor had no clothes on, and that 59% of readers will share an article on Facebook without actually reading it. So analytics today, you have this kind of dichotomy where you've got people who are racing ahead in data-reliant industries, doing hugely wonderful things with data. And don't get me wrong, some within publishing, some of that is happening. But within engagement metrics, we're still stuck sort of navel-gazing, really. Davenport talks about this third era of analytics that we're in now. And he talks about the data-powered industries now currently experiencing rapid and integral use of data at the highest levels, empowering decision-making with organizations. While we see in the editorial industry, editors struggling to find time to do their jobs, find time to look at analytics, or even train in how to respond to analytics. Not sure what questions to ask. Davenport spots multiple data types being combined, while we're enslaved to tools that are developed for marketing, rather than, marketing that emphasize single metrics over reliance, vanity metrics, real-time data, and that kind of thing. I think I should just briefly talk about why I'm so down on things like single metrics and page views. I think a lot of people here will be aware of the fact that we're less and less interested in page views, but many people may not be sure of why that is. So I'll just quickly explain these things. These are what we call single metrics. They're metrics that are taken on their own and taken to mean something on their own. So very simply, a page view in most metrics packages symbolizes little more than a browser firing. It's nothing more than that. It's a record of a technical occurrence. It tells you nothing at all about whether anybody stayed around to read your article. It doesn't tell you any more than that. Similarly, time spent on page, it's sometimes called dwell time. This would tell you very simply that a browser tab stayed open for a period of time. It's not telling you whether somebody's reading that. They could have gone off and made a cup of tea, had a beer, watched some football, whatever it might be, and just left your browser open. It's not telling you anything at all. More recently, we hear this much more, scroll depth, which is a slightly less simple record of user movement taking place on a screen. It's a similar problem. Taken alone, it doesn't record much more beyond how far they got. It doesn't say that they stopped, doesn't tell you that they looked around, just that they got there, and that's how far they got. It doesn't tell you anything to do with engagement, which is what a lot of people think they're being told when they look at that. Now, many people in the editorial industry will be aware of this, and some of you may be aware of this, but many are not. And I think that's a kind of ridiculous situation to be in, that we've built this industry, this digital publishing industry, on metrics that fundamentally we don't understand. And that we're attempting to monetize a large part of that industry on metrics that we fundamentally don't understand. Similarly, I'm a little bit down on real-time metrics because that's the big trend at the moment, and I'm not down on it simply because of a trend. I'm down on it for very specific reasons. I believe that real-time encourages editors to chase those page views that we've just established are useless in the first place. So a quick example of that would be an editor might look at trending news, and he'll probably be using, or she will probably be using tools to look at trending things that all their competitors are using at the same time. So you're getting this homogenized sense of news. So he'll have a look at the trending news, and the editor will take a look and maybe commission 4 or 5 articles around that trend just to cover all of the bases. The story will race to the top of the real-time screens. Wonderful. Dopamine levels up. The editor orders more of the same stuff because it seems to be working. The story drops in popularity, but the editor and his team are milking it for all they're worth. This is the point where real-time metrics actually is important or useful, because this is the area where the editor of a front page can look at what's happening at the moment and really milk it for those last few reads and those last few clicks. And then he rinses and he repeats, and we're going around again, encouraging page views. And what I really dislike about this is that I think it feeds that dreaded echo chamber that we heard so much about last year. I think what we're seeing here is that it encourages editors and journalists to give readers what readers think they want. The days of editorial actually informing readers and shaping conversations start to slip away. And it feeds that temptation to ditch what originally made the publication interesting, an individual interesting publication. Again, it's homogenizing the news. Readers start to find it hard to differentiate between your news brands. And publications without anything specific to say, they could be huge publications, but without anything specific to say, they're just repeating trends, they start to find it difficult. To have a voice, and so they start to disappear. So we talk a little bit, this morning Jon Wilks talks a bit about what we do, and we talk a lot about scored metrics. So to really understand reader engagement through metrics, I think scored metrics are really required. And scored metrics are a way of analysing and comparing those single metrics that we've looked at to see how they interact to tell a story of reader behaviour. It's not simply adding those single metrics together. Done well, you can really observe how engaged a reader is at every point in the article, and you can adjust that article, it being digital, accordingly. So across the industry, we're starting to see that there's a call for a standardized article score. I have to get his name right, but Kritsanarat Kunkum of Die Welt, he spoke last year at the WANIFRA conference in London about an article score, and again, Jon Wilks has mentioned it this morning that they're using 6 metrics to try to develop this article score, whereas we're using around 30 at the moment. In our neighbouring industry, in the industry that pays us quite often, we're looking at similar things. Mark Pritchard of Procter & Gamble has called for the ad world to grow up and start using industry standard verification metrics, which is music to our ears at Content Insights, because we've spent half a decade perfecting and adjusting that article score and what it does, and we call it CPI. Recently, Süddeutsche Zeitung picked it up along with the South China Morning Post and a whole load of others, and rather than me just try to sell it to you now, I suggest you go and talk to our guys over there afterwards. And so, to round up, I just want to talk a little bit about what I think the future of editorial analytics should be. First of all, I think we need to recalibrate our approach to metrics and analytics. We need to develop tools that are made by us as editors, for us as editors, rather than just using something that everybody else is using in a different industry. It's looking at completely different things. The editorial industry needs to fully subscribe to the idea that single metrics alone aren't going to tell you enough if you're looking for reader engagement. We need to instead look at scored metrics or something of that nature that understands how the strands of data that we gather relate to one another. I think editors also need to admit more readily that having access to data is not enough, that we need to know what questions to ask of that data, and we need to better understand what it means and how we can implement it to improve our performance. Otherwise, the little time that we have to spare is being utterly wasted. And finally, I think we have to stop chasing that dopamine buzz. We have to build trust by defining and strengthening what your editorial strategy is, rather than chasing what you think the audience wants. I think scored editorial metrics will help us get there, and I think it really will help us to avoid that dreaded echo chamber. I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'll be over there enjoying coffee. Thank you.